So if we look at the formation of our government that exists today, we definitely need to talk about how did we get to where we are, which has us go back and take a look at the formation of this Constitution that institutes our government, and we have to look at it from this historical perspective. So we know that, and I'm not talking, we're not going to go all the way back to Columbus and Mayflower and all of that. You will have the chance to do that with a project that we're going to start tomorrow, which I'll describe then. But I'm going to kind of fast forward here to like right before independence, where these 13 individual distinct colonies that have their own individual personal relationships with the British government. Okay? It wasn't like that we were a unified set of 13 colonies and they just referred to them all as the Americas. While they may have said Americas, but specifically, it wasn't like, the colonies got to elect someone to a colonial congress and then they got to take their demands to the British government. No, the British government dealt with each one of those colonies as distinct individual colonies. So Maryland dealt with the Crown, and New Jersey dealt with the Crown, and South Carolina dealt with the Crown. Then we get going on, and there's this event that happens in the 1750s called the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is kind of a regional conflict that existed within a larger war called the 7 Years' War that took place between the British and French in Europe. But because these were two global powers, the French and the British, and they were engaging in conflicts in Europe, it also meant that their conflict spilled over into areas where they both had colonies. And because they both had colonies in the Americas, the British, those 13 colonies, and the French, the whole, what we eventually called the Louisiana Territory, all belonging to them. A couple things happen here as part of this conflict. One of the things that happens is the British send their varsity team, and they're all fighting the French in Europe, but they send kind of a JV squad over here to help protect the American colonists, who are really technically British citizens, from attacks by Native American groups who had aligned themselves with the French. And so what it did is it took volunteer soldiers from, say, South Carolina or from Virginia or from New York, and now these colonists began to interact with each other. Okay, and they began to say, hey, these are the things that concern us in New York. These are the things that concern us in Pennsylvania or in Connecticut or in Massachusetts. And they start to have conversations with one another. Okay? Then, after this war is over, and by the way, the British win, they decide to do a couple of things that are going to anger these colonists. One of the things that the British said was that this conflict in the Americas where it was taking place, part of it was due to the expansion of colonists into territories further to the west, encroaching upon lands of Native Americans, which then irritated Native Americans, who then began to launch attacks on frontier settlements. And then in order to protect the people on the frontier, the British had to send in troops, which cost them money. So how do you save money? How do you prevent these attacks from happening? You tell people you can't expand any further west. Okay? Now, by this point here, this is what colonists had always envisioned, was they could continue whenever they needed new land, just keep going west and west and west, and it would never run out. Okay? Now the British are telling them, no, you can't do this thing that you want to do. So how are they going to take that? How are they going to react? They're going to get angry. Okay? The second thing that happens here is that because the British were here to protect the interests of the colonists against attacks by the French and by the British, they said, you know what, you should have to help pay the bill for us sending troops over to help protect all of you. You shouldn't just do it because we're nice and kind-hearted and we want to, prop you up and keep you economically viable. And the colonists said, well, no, wait a minute. We're not going to pay any new taxes that will help go towards offsetting the costs of that war, and wars are always costly. And the British said, well, that's too bad. We're going to impose this tax called the Stamp Act. Okay? What the Stamp Act did is it placed a well, we think of stamps as that little piece of postage, right, that we use to help pay for mailing something. Okay, and yes, that was part of the Stamp Act, but really the Stamp Act was more about a tax on anything that would use paper. Okay, and this is back in a time in the 1700s where if you wanted to communicate ideas to a larger group of people, how would you do that? Through letters, right? Mail, and you would buy stationery and envelopes and you would have to send them. So you'd have to pay a tax on that stationery. Who else is going to use just a whole boatload of paper? Newspaper, okay? Anyone who owns a newspaper, okay? So now let's think it's the late 1700s, mid to late 1700s. Who is probably the biggest user of paper? Because he maybe prints, like these Poor Richard's almanacs, and he prints like the Philadelphia newspaper, and he's just like super big into newspapers like all over the place. What? Ben Franklin. And by the way, one of the most well-known people of the day, and probably one of the wealthier ones as well. Do you think in particular Ben Franklin is going to want to have to foot the bill to this stamp tax that's being placed on all of these different colonists, but it definitely hits him in the pocketbook? No. So what's Ben Franklin going to do? He's going to round up a bunch of other people who also similarly have gripes against the British and say, hey, let's do something about this. Okay? So what they do, they form this really colonial Congress, this first kind of continental Congress, and they decide to take their complaints to the king. And who volunteers right away to go say, hey, I want to bring these complaints to the king? Who volunteers? Who do you think? Ben Franklin does. So he leaves and he goes to London and he, meets with Parliament and he meets with some people over there trying to say, hey, guys, this is not really fair. We're just poor American colonists, even though he's really not, but he's trying to speak for them. And he says things like, you know what, if you want us to pay this tax, okay, but only if we get a say in whether or not we are taxed in the first place. In other words, what Ben Franklin is asking the British government for is representation in their parliament. And so here we then kind of start to get this big movement which is going to carry us through the revolution, this whole kind of rallying cry, no taxation without representation. Okay, and it kind of carries all the way through. For their part, the king doesn't listen. The king wants no part of it, just wants to keep exploiting the colonies and using them as he sees fit. So Ben Franklin, though, while he was in London, has anybody seen these stories about Ben Franklin that have been out, recently? By that, maybe within the last 5 years. One of the apartments that he was living in London, when he was there, they found remains, human skeletal remains, in the basement of where he was staying while he was there. You didn't hear this? Did you hear this? What did they find out? Was Ben Franklin secretly like Jack the Ripper and a serial killer?
I don't remember 100%, but he might have one of the theories was that he was trying to study human bodies with people, so he was grave robbing and stuff.
That's exactly what he was doing. So he was grave robbing and then bringing them back and cutting these corpses open and really studying the human anatomy. How were they able to prove that? Well, they were able to see the marks on bones from knives or scalpels and those sort of things that he was using. And so no, he wasn't a secret serial killer while he was there, even though some news reports when they first saw that kind of jumped on that and tried to make that claim, but that's fake news. Okay, now, as time goes on, and Americans, they had to kind of accept that stamp tax even though they didn't really like it. The British found themselves in more need of money. And when they found themselves in more need of money, they also found the colonists not very receptive to other new taxes that they wanted to impose. One of the suggestions that the British had is they wanted to impose a new tax on tea. And of course, are the colonists going to want to have a tax on their favorite beverage, which as good British citizens during that day, they had their tea time in the afternoon? And no. So what does Sam Adams and some of his buddies then do? They form this group called the Sons of Liberty, and what do they do one night in Boston? They spill the tea out into the harbor. Now, how are the British going to react to this? Are they going to say, oh, yep, our bad, we'll take that away? Or are they going to be even more repressive towards those people? And not just on taxes anymore, but on some of their other liberties. Okay, imposing curfews, requiring things to be presented to a British official before they could be printed into newspapers. So the censorship stuff. They would impose limits on the rights to their lawful assemblies. So these things and ideas that the British are starting to take away here at this point become known to the colonists as these intolerable acts. And what are we going to see when we create our own constitution? We're going to put safeguards into there, specifically into the Bill of Rights, to prevent the government from taking away things like the right to lawful assembly, the right to free speech, and the right to, of course, Ben Franklin would say, freedom of the press. So it is enough, though, to get these colonists who had, since the French and Indian War, had been talking with one another to come together to try to do something about this. So, led by this guy, Thomas Jefferson, decides to write this document at some point when the colonists had realized that there is no more agreement that can be salvaged between the British government and the newly minted American states that will keep them together. So they draft this Declaration of Independence, issue it on July 4th, 1776, and in it we find three different parts. Okay? The first part is probably the most famous part of the Declaration of Independence. This is the part that goes something like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? And again, he steals some of this work, though, Thomas Jefferson does, from an earlier British philosopher whose name was John Locke, okay? Who also developed this idea of natural rights or human rights, but Locke referred to them as life, liberty, and property. Why do you think Jefferson would have included the first two but changed the third one from property to pursuit of happiness? What did they have in the colonies, in the early states by that point, that maybe would have made using the term property maybe not too accurate? Slavery, right? Okay. The second part is actually the longest part of the Declaration of Independence. It's called the List of Grievances. If Jefferson says, you're going to break away, maybe I should wait right here and pause. I think we're about to leave for lunch. Okay. Pause.